Chapter 4. Who memorized in Judaism? In this chapter, we want to point out different individuals and institutions that memorize the Holy Bible and rabbinic literature over the history of Judaism. In doing so, I hope to highlight the necessity put on memorization by that niche of the populace at different periods of time. Even when the Jewish people were not immersed in an oral world, the broad masses have always been more persuadable to the appeal of oral proclamation than to a written version. In fact, all great religious movements in Judaism were popular oral movements. The memorized oral proclamations were the volcanic eruptions of human passions and emotions stirred into activity by the torch of the spoken word cast into the midst of the people. It is these memorizers who lit such a burning fire under the Jewish people and spurred them on to piety and reform. The storyteller in the biblical period. What was the role of the storyteller in the biblical period, and what place did memorization have in their oral performance? Unfortunately, the ancient history of the Jewish storyteller is shrouded in obscurity. Our only source for this person is the best source, the Bible, but only a few small details can cast light on the subject. In biblical times, there must have been expert storytellers who specialized in recounting the histories of Israel, but we know little about such people. These popular storytellers, familiar with Bible songs and stories, likely wandered about the country and were to be found for hire, or in the king's palace and in the open-air marketplaces and popular feasts. A good case can be made that stories such as Ruth were handed down by memory, in the elevated prose style which we have in the written transmission, and were originally composed in an oral style and told by such people. Differences of performance between one story and another would be due to the individual creativity of the storytellers, each of whom could likely recite many famous stories from the Bible. Some have suggested that the identity of the itinerant speakers in the time of Josiah were the Levites, who had the task of going around the country teaching and explaining the Torah. All that being said, we really don't know much of anything about these ancient performers. But we can use modern-day reflections from the Middle East that can help paint a picture of what a storytelling session might have looked like long ago. For example, let us consider the modern-day Bedouin storyteller as a window into this oral world. I stayed with a Bedouin in Wadi Rum in Jordan for a short time, and during one evening the time came for the evening entertainment. In the midst of a desert ocean, half a dozen Bedouin men arose from around the campfire and from memory sang Bedouin folk songs, tales, and chapters of the Quran. They sang such oral literature from heart with ease and in complete unison with one another without the aid of music at first. One can readily imagine how easy it could be as an audience member after hearing such rhythmic melodies even a few times to memorize what the men were singing. I think that this example is a window of what could have been expected of an ancient Israelite storyteller in this conservative and slow-paced region of the world. The poet in the biblical period. The oral poet, though similar in function to the storyteller, had a different role in ancient Israelite society. Like the storyteller, we know little about the role of the oral poet, and our information comes from inferences from the Bible alone. The oral poet was one who often transmitted and composed poetry without the aid of writing, and reproduced their poems on demand with the aid of a fixed vocabulary and a powerful and highly trained mind. We can imagine David shepherding the flock in the Judean wilderness, and through his real-life experiences coming up with Psalm 23, or lying under an olive tree on the outskirts of Bethlehem in the night and looking up to the heavens and composing Psalm 8, and then singing these songs to an audience who would memorize them. Due to lack of evidence, especially at the sociological level, much of the surmise concerning oral elements in ancient Hebrew poetry must remain conjecture. We know very little about the oral performer, or about their social position, the behavior of the audience, where and when the performances took place, and so on. We do know that the poets, along with the scribes, were the custodians of tradition. Their art was an expression of the life of the Jewish community. Their narratives and poems were filled with ideas and theologies characteristic not only of the soul of the author, but of the geographical and cultural surroundings in which they lived. The religious works of the people, their poetry and stories of their heroes, were maintained by these poets who had learned their craft, their stories, and their way of telling them from their elders, and practiced it in much the same way to the next generation. The scribe in the biblical period. Unless one wanted to read a scroll from beginning to end in one or a series of sittings, the scroll was cumbersome as a handy source of information. The most effective use of the scroll for information retrieval was available only to scribes themselves who had access to one, and were so familiar with the text that they would know where to find what they needed. The text was as much a fact of their memory as it was a physical object. The primary function of a scribe is that of one whose work consisted in transcribing a text by his own hand. The scribe may perform his professional work in many ways. He may preferably copy out his text by eye, having beside him the authoritative text to be transcribed. This method relies on the purely visual medium and the regular split-second effort of memory with or without oral repetition of what he is transcribing. On the other hand, the scribe may transcribe his text from dictation, like Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah, in chapter 36. This method relies on the purely oral medium and oral memory, which perhaps, again, some oral repetition of what has just been read to him for transcription. Or a third way, he may transcribe his text from memory. We see a later example of this in Rabbinic Judaism when Rabbi Meyer copied the book of Esther from memory while in Ephesus. Though, as we previously read, the strictest rules governed the copying of the Torah in the Second Temple period. Well-educated scribes could likely write out verbatim, memorized forms of an authoritative text. We have examples of this we will see later in the Rabbinic period. Everyday people in the biblical period. In general, it can be assumed that the audiences were not mere passive spectators to an oral enactment, but joined in actively when a storyteller or poet spoke a familiar account. We see this even today, and have to wonder how far back the audience's verbal reaction at the name of Haman and the oral rendition of the book of Esther during Purim has gone on for. Of such activities, we can glean a few hints from the Bible. Refrains and questions from the Psalms show that the people listening were not always mute. For example, "Who is the King of glory?" And someone would respond, "The Lord of hosts, he is the King of glory," Psalm 24. And the phrase, "For his mercy endures forever," is repeated by the audience after each of the 26 stanzas in Psalm 136. This particular psalm was designed to be directed by a Levitical choir instructor, with the audience chiming in from memory at the second stanza of every verse. This psalm was sung in the Temple of Solomon on the day of its dedication, and was also sung 4 generations later by the singers appointed by Jehoshaphat, who went ahead of the troops to battle in the Judean wilderness. The oral interplay between the director and the audience likely helped to foster memorization and preserve these psalms to the next generation. Social settings in the biblical period. The term social setting includes not only a particular community activity like preaching, but also cultural characteristics of the community. For example, how texts were used generally throughout the culture. Broadly speaking, at least 3 main classes of occasion can be identified where stories and songs would be sung in ancient Israel: family affairs, intertribal occasions such as feast and liturgical festivals, and informal social gatherings. Let me explain. Before and after birth, there were oracles spoken, Genesis 25, Isaiah 11, and explanations of names given, Genesis 18. Coming of age was marked by an oral blessing, Genesis 27, and marriage was an excuse for a feast at which songs were sung and riddle contests held, Judges 14. At death, a final blessing could be in poetic form, Genesis 49, and there were often funeral chants, Jeremiah 22. Songs were also sung from heart at work, while digging a well, Numbers 21, harvesting, Isaiah 16, or guarding the city, Isaiah 21. The Jews streaming to Jerusalem from all over the land would sing traditional songs from memory, such as the Psalms of Ascent. We can also imagine an informal setting like a social gathering of a community. People would come expecting to listen to and recite the tradition of the community. This kind of gathering is called in Hebrew samar, which means to preserve. The community would gather to preserve its store of historical recollections and inherited wisdom. Nothing would be concretely planned. There is no designated storyteller, nor any guild of storytellers who alone are allowed to speak. With some limits, young and old, male and female, who know how to tell the story the correct way, can recite. Yet, what is happening is considered serious and deemed important enough, though the setting is informal. In this orally dominant environment of the biblical period, almost every aspect of life, from birth to marriage to death, was integrated into the memory by phrasing or singing such accounts in a memorable storyteller in the rabbinic period. Telling and retelling stories was also a favored oral characteristic in the rabbinic period. The temptation today in talking about the meaning of a story is to summarize what happened in it, or to tell what values it affirms, thereby reducing the storytelling to a communication device instead of letting the words of the story speak for themselves and trusting that the audience is intelligent enough to grasp its content. One only needs to read a few pages in the Talmud to see how fundamental storytelling was in instructing the Jews in the oral law. There was not a reason to summarize the main points of the story to the listener, but let the story speak and teach on its own 2 legs. The scribe in the rabbinic period. Many of the scribes during the rabbinic period were like those in ancient Israel. That is to say, they could speak and write out much of the Bible, if not all of it, from heart. Not all scribes had, like Rabbi Huna, copied the entire Torah 70 times, or like Rabbi Ishmael ben Joseph or Rabbi Haya, who knew the text so well that they could write out the whole of scriptures from memory. But despite their extraordinary capacity for memorizing, Rabbinic Judaism had an emphatically repeated rule that the written Torah was not to be copied out from memory in order to safeguard the transmission of the text. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. We read that Rabbi Meyer, while in Ephesus, on finding out that a Hebrew scroll of the book of Esther was missing, was compelled to write the complete book from memory just in time to be able to read from the book at the Purim festival. This is not to say that Rabbinic Judaism did not encourage memorization of the Bible. We have numerous examples in the Talmud of young men training in the academy being quizzed on their memory verses. The copyist who wanted to transmit the written Torah according to the oral law had to have a written edition before him. Not a single letter might be copied without having the text before one's eyes. As we saw from Rabbi Ishmael ben Joseph and Rabbi Haya, it is probable that numerous scribes during the rabbinic period had the whole of scriptures memorized because of their copying out the Tanakh so many times. The rabbi in the rabbinic period. The deliberate use of memorizing that we earlier saw in the 1st century AD gave the Hebrew language and its forms of expression some highly individual characteristics. Since many of the texts that were learned by heart were taken from the oral and written Torah, the learner's mind was stored with biblical and oral Torah facts, sentences, and figures, which explains the innumerable echoes that were likely to be heard in the speech of the Jewish people at that time. The teachers of Judaism, wishing both to help the memory and to imprint the learning that it was to retain and transmit it as deeply as possible, had devised a whole system of mnemonics, rhythms, melodies, alliterations, repetition of words, which made the recollection of the verbal elements easier throughout the rabbinic period. I list numerous techniques that were used to memorize in Judaism later in the book. The rabbis were well aware that memorization could be facilitated by a technique, sometimes simple, sometimes advanced. The experiences and observations of centuries of memorization had produced real results. When we come to the time the Talmud was closed in the 6th century AD, we find a technique of mnemonics which had developed enormously. These mnemonic features were the nuts and bolts that facilitated memorization for the rabbis. Some rabbis received special mention for their extraordinary ability to memorize. Rabbi Judah ben Ai is particularly noted among the Tannanites, and Rabbi Nachman ben Isaac and Rabbi Judah ben Hanai among the Amoraic rabbis. That is not to say that they were the only rabbis who were mindful of the process of mnemonic techniques. That they are singled out for special mention is evidently due to the fact that they distinguished themselves from other rabbis by laying particular emphasis on themselves and their students for the necessity to memorize. The rabbis passed on various rules for strengthening the memory, but stressed above all the principle of continual verbal repetition. Consider the interesting story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The story tells of Rabbi Zakkai in the camp of the Roman Vespasian outside the Old City in the 1st century AD. After Rabbi Zakkai had been received an audience by the Roman for the first time, they seized him and locked him up with 7 locks and asked him what time it was at night. And he told them, and what time it was during the day. And he told them, and how did our master Yochanan ben Zakkai know? From his recitation of the Mishnah. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan not only knew the entire Mishnah by heart, but he knew just how long it took to recite each paragraph and how much time he needed to get through it all. This account is a proper reflection of the orality and emphasis on memorization in the rabbinic world of the 1st century AD. There are more examples of the emphasis put on repetition as the key mnemonic tool. Rabbi Sheshet was in the habit of repeating everything he had learned every 30th day, after which he would lean against a door and say, "Rejoice, my soul! Rejoice, my soul! To you I have read the scriptures from memory, for you I have repeated." And of other rabbis, it is said that when the angel of death stood at the threshold, they bayed for a little bit of time, during which time they would repeat from heart all they knew of the Torah. Obviously, memorization was the linchpin that held together all of the oral teachings in the rabbinic world. Repetition was the key of keys, implemented by the rabbis to impregnate the heart and mind with Torah in the rabbinic period. This period could be considered the golden age of memorization and gives us the most insight into the emphasis placed upon memorization and the techniques used to facilitate memorization in the rabbinic world. The professional memorizer in the rabbinic period. Even though the designation Tana, which literally means repeater, referring to an official memorizer of oral Torah, appears for the first time in connection to Rabbi Akiva in the 1st century AD, the office was solidified later in the rabbinic colleges into something of an institution. These Tanaim were counted on as being living books connected with the rabbinic college for the purpose of memorizing and repeating aloud the oral text in the classroom. They were purely and simply verbatim repeaters at the disposal of the teachers and students of the college. It was with the aid of such skilled professional memorizers that the rabbis in the colleges preserved the oral Torah in an authorized form until written copies began to be of official importance. Lecturers in the college would ask such Tanaim to recite a portion of the oral Torah the lecture intended to expound, or to refresh the rabbi's memory of the exact wording of a particular passage. The Tana would then with ease say from memory the requested passage. The Talmud warns that despite their ability to recite long passages without error, some professional memorizers were not always to be treated as scholars. The rabbis characterize many of these living books as follows. The magician mumbles and does not understand what he says. Similarly, the memorizer recited but does not understand. This does not mean that no Tana had any insight into the interpretation of the text, but apparently many Tana were not at a level of rabbinic education that included the ability to interpret the text meaning correctly. This phenomena of knowing the verbatim wording of a text, but not knowing its interpretation, is something we will see again later during the modern period among the Shas Polak. The rabbis were conscious of the variable accuracy and reliability of the different oral traditions. Some Tana became famous for their extreme precision and could become the teacher's living reference book. Yet, other Tanaim were regarded as being less reliable. Rabbi Benjamin ben Japhet was placed beneath Rabbi Haya ben Abba, since the latter gave more careful consideration to the texts and repeated them every month before his teacher. The amount of memorized texts by the Tanaim also varied. Some had only a few texts at their mental disposal, while others had them all. As we shall see later, this phenomenon exists today in the Silberstein Yeshiva, where some of the students have half of the Mishnah memorized and others have almost the whole book memorized. We have a Talmudic statement defining the standard in Amoraic times of one who could be counted as a fully qualified Tana. Such a one must repeat from memory all the most important collections of tradition, in the same way a scripture specialist must know the whole scripture accurately from memory. Not only did the Tanaim serve as living books, but they also were secondary teachers in the college. The Tanaim knew the Mishnah or the Talmud with their correct cantillations by heart and trained students also to memorize them by rote. The cantillation, or reciting a text in a singing manner with clear indication of short and long intervals, was of high practical importance in the oral world. The Mishnah and Talmud at that time carried neither punctuation marks nor vowel signs, and even when it did, one had to be taught the correct recitation. Therefore, both the pronunciation of the individual words and the correct division of a sentence into its various components depended entirely on memorization. Since this teaching is strictly oral, if it was not faithfully handed down over the generations, the proper cantillation would be lost. For example, the Yemenite Jews, who to this day retained the ancient institute of the Tanaim, possess a sound knowledge of the correct pronunciation of the Talmudic texts, especially of the Mishnah, a tradition lost to many European Jews. The office of the Tanaim became less important or even extinct in some parts of the Jewish world beginning sometime in the medieval period, when written books became more frequently published and all the labor that would have to go into producing a living book seemed less practical. Hasidic storytelling. As we leave the medieval period, we still find examples of an emphasis on orality in Jewish thought and practice. In the 18th century, Hasidics encouraged storytelling, moving it from the periphery to the center of their worship and missionary work. Many rabbis praised storytelling as a mitzvah and a spiritual practice. They reflected on it deeply and taught about its significance. In the world of Judaism, there was and is nothing like it outside the Hasidim. Not only did rabbis often tell stories, they instructed their Hasidim to do likewise. As a result, telling and listening to tales became as popular as never before and were enthusiastically embraced by the masses of ordinary Hasidim. This revival of religious storytelling played a major role in the rapid growth of the Hasidic movement to this day. The place of storytelling in Hasidim goes back to its founder, Israel Baal Shem Tov, in 1777. For 10 years, he wandered about from one place to another in Eastern Europe to draw people to Judaism by storytelling. He and his followers told such stories as the Book of Moses, the Tale of the Prophets, and the Sages of the Talmud from memory. For religion to reach the common people, it must be presented in a popular way, and stories do just that. As I noted in the introduction and as we see here, the broad masses of a population are more open to the appeal of rhetoric than to any written force. The professional memorizer in the modern period. Let us move forward to the 20th century and see if memorization still played a key role in Judaism. In 1917, psychologist George Stratton's attention was directed towards a special achievement in Talmudic memorization, similar to what we saw in the Tana during the Rabbinic period. The Babylonian Talmud consists of 12 large volumes comprising thousands of pages. All the printed editions of the Talmud have exactly the same number of pages and the same words on each page to foster memorization. Stratton's friend, Reverend Philipson, interviewed a Jewish man who knew, like many of the Tanaim of old, the whole Talmud by memory. Philipson would open one of the volumes of the Talmud, Say the tractate Berachot at page 10. Place a pin on a word, say the fourth word in line 8. Then would ask the man what word is in this same spot on page 58 or any other page. The pin would be pressed through the volume until it reached page 58, and the man's memory would say the word that it was found to be correct. The man had visually memorized or mentally photocopied the whole Talmud on his brain. Many people would say this is impossible. But the Talmud was written and is formatted to be memorized, and with proper dedication can be entirely memorized. The technical name which was used by the Jews to designate these memory experts was Shas Polak. Shas is the abbreviation for the Hebrew terms for the Talmud, and Polak is Pole. Nearly all these memorized experts came from Poland. Philipson witnessed, though, that the achievement was purely mechanical, like the earlier criticism we heard of some Tana in the rabbinic period. The Pole could not interpret the Talmud, though he knew its entire contents by heart. The mnemonic ability of these men did not represent the normal emphasis put on memorization in the world of Judaism at that time. And we don't know from the interviews why these men memorized the whole Talmud, nor if they functioned like the ancient Tanaim in their colleges in 20th century Poland. It is very likely that what we will observe in regards to the normative importance placed upon memorization today in Judaism was the same as it was last century and the century before. The rabbi in the modern period. In order to get an idea of what level of importance is laid on memorization of the oral and written Torah within Judaism today, I interviewed Rabbi Shlomo, which means Solomon, at the Return Yeshiva on Mount Zion, right outside of the Old City, right below Jerusalem University College where I went to school. Like the rabbis of old who emphasized repetition as the key to memorization, Rabbi Shlomo said, "The Torah world is a world of repetition. A person who does not repeat is like a person who sows and does not reap. We were always told as kids that we must repeat the commandments again and again. There were no other techniques we used to memorize other than verbal repetition. The only way we memorize is by repeating. We were told repeating it 100 times is not like repeating it 101 times." Rabbi Shlomo came from an Orthodox background, so I asked him if he could tell me what emphasis was laid on memorization in his formative educational years. The yeshiva I went to as a kid did not ask us to memorize Bible verses by heart, but there are schools like that, such as the Silberstein Yeshiva in the Old City. There was in my later education an emphasis not on memorizing Bible verses, but rabbinic cases and opinions, the Talmud and the Mishnah. I asked Rabbi Shlomo to tell me about oral tradition and transmission. I follow an oral tradition that was originally given at Mount Sinai by Hashem to Moses. These include such things as meat and milk and how you are to live with your wife. Growing up, we didn't even have to try and memorize all these commandments. They just become second nature because we grew up in an oral world. It is a world of habitual memorization. Your parents teach you to memorize by doing an action again and again, and you thereby memorize it by not even knowing it. The goal is not just memorize this and memorize that, but to memorize it and carry out the action with the right motive. I asked him about the emphasis on memorizing oral law and the Bible in the Jewish world. He said, "In my education, we memorize much more oral law than Bible in order to try and learn things that apply to daily life. We memorize sayings that have to do with everything from daily life, such as a prayer when I tie my shoe and eat an apple. I then asked Shlomo if he knew of anyone, like the Shas Polak, who had the entire Talmud memorized. When I was a kid, I knew of a man named Rabbi Yoshua Cohen, who had the whole Talmud memorized. We used to read to him from a page, and he could tell you what page it was on throughout the whole Talmud. Not only did Rabbi Yeshua have a lot memorized, but many Hazan today who weekly read for Moses in the synagogue know the first 5 books by heart because they have been reading them for so many years. Even though they know Moses by heart, in the synagogue service, they must read from the text. Finally, I asked him how popular memorization was today in Judaism. He said, "It is very rare to find Jews today who know many of the writings word by word from heart." After I talked with Rabbi Shlomo, I came away with the impression that whether he knew it or not, he was talking to me in memorized oral Torah language. He quoted or paraphrased numerous portions from the Talmud. I think he represents your average Jewish student rabbi's view of memorization in the 21st century, that it is very rare to find Jews today who know many of the writings word by word from heart. But on the other hand, they know portions of the oral writings from heart, not because they deliberately went out of their way to memorize them, but because they live and move in an oral world, and they were memorized as part of their childhood education and stayed in a long-term memory because of constant verbal repetition. Conclusion, Chapter 4. We must stand afar off from our Western cultural mindset of solely written transmission and move across to a Middle Eastern oral mindset to better understand the emphasis and favor put on memorization over the ages. As we have read, memorization was and is a highly sought-after endowment in the world of Judaism. The ability and drive to memorize complete books seems to have been limited to those whose profession revolved around the Torah. Just how much your average Jewish person had memorized during the times we trace is impossible to tell, and the testimonies of living persons today seems to point towards vast memorization of the Torah to be for the very few. I would like to finish this section with a story. Charles Glass, a journalist in Syria, described time spent in a village there 20 years ago. In the remote places of Syria, he visited an archaeologist studying the similarities between ancient and modern villages. The archaeologist told Glass, "There are so many similarities that it is as if the village we're in now, if you came back in 2,000 years, would be the same as the village we're digging up at the moment. Of course, there are implements they didn't have, like the oil drums, the gas stoves, or whatever, but everything else is the same. The mud houses are the same. The wooden ceilings are made in the same way. The design of the town is the same now as it was then. If you just look around the village, you don't have to look far to see the same thing in the ruins. You can see yourself how biblical it is." As well, if you just look around Jerusalem, you don't have to look far to see those who, like the living books of old, have memorized vast amounts of primarily oral Torah. Sure, the time and technologies have changed, but these living books still walk Jerusalem's narrow streets. You can see how rabbinic their world still is. Yet, just as the remote village of today has not changed much over the millennia, I suspect people's attitudes toward memorizing have pretty much stayed the same as well. It was and is the rare exception to find memorization experts of the written Torah in the world of Judaism, but the common people did and still have a meager amount of prayers and portions of the oral and written Torah memorized.